Philosophy in a minor key. In seeking an essentially logical foundation for Leibniz's metaphysics founded on a priori truths and the theory of substance that follows from it, 1680 to 1684, all the while declaring the rest of Leibniz's work as hopelessly confused, Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, aimed to explain the fantastic fairy tale of the monadology and why such a sound mathematician as Leibniz came up with such a bizarre system. He argued that Leibniz had a good philosophy, which after Arnold's criticisms he kept to himself, and a bad philosophy which he published with a view to fame, money, and the admiration of princes and even more of princesses. Correspondence with De Bossis, too, could thus be interpreted as more the concession of a diplomat than the creed of a philosopher. This judgment is repeated, if more elaborately, by Brandon Look, who concludes that the idea of the vinculum is such that Leibniz certainly would not have held it. This is a bit of a complex one, but the vinculum is the idea of a bond. And if you see a mathematical equation like a fraction where it's got a 1 and then a line like a third, the vinculum is the line, and that appears in things like pi. Leibniz didn't create the vinculum. It was later mathematicians who were rationalizing Leibniz's work. It was actually created by a Dutch mathematician a little bit later on. So here we are, Brandon Look saying that this idea of the vinculum is such that Leibniz certainly should not have held it. But what if the vinculum is precisely the substantializer without which the monadology, indeed philosophy itself, would indeed have remained a fantastic fairy tale? Interpreters, to read Leibniz is to become an insider, whereas in a dialectical approach, it is to become an outsider. If contemporary philosophers are drawn to the late Leibniz, it is not just because here they find the most pointed and crystallized formulations of some of his primary principles and derivative maxims, but also because these principles and maxims are immediately betrayed in or perverted by their consequences. Leibniz's mode of writing is centrifugal in the sense that it resists reductive syntheses, but it also has a centripetal force that is passed on in its supplementary reverberations. In this sense, both Deleuze and Agamben rely heavily on the commentary by Christian Fremont, who argues that far from being a marginal superaddition, the substantial bond forms a crucial element in the Leibnizian doctrine of the communication of substances. Whereas global harmony may offer moral certitude, it provides no metaphysical certitude regarding our perceptions. It accounts for the most general but also least obliging type of communication, the inter-expression of monads, but cannot account for local harmony at the level of this or that composite body. From this, Fremont concludes that global harmony is nothing more than the horizon or driving force of all communication, whereas the problem of real union is its enabling constraint and the Eucharist the model of all the other possible forms of communication. Proceeding in a piecemeal manner, embodied in constantly shifting couplings and ever renewed consistencies, in music, to modificare, means to harmonize. Real union is therefore richer, more varied, and hence more substantial than mere harmony. And in the end, it is only in this secondary way that everything comes back to substance, even relationships. Perhaps the substantializing bond is not only a problem for the history of philosophy, but instead something that has to remain historically undecidable and suspends judgment, a singularity or speculative problem. The real union of soul and body, or the incarnation, is a paradoxical element in Leibniz's philosophical system. It is both a faithful inspiration and an impious betrayal. It is true that the major texts written around or after 1710, such as the Theodicy, Monadology, and Principles of Nature and of Grace, do not use the result of the letters in their account of the body. But maybe this is because it would have implied rethinking the system in its entirety. In following the work, we must distinguish its modalities. Who does Leibniz address and why? Are we sure that we have acquired the right interpretive key to respond to his call? Does the vinculum not establish a different manner of echo between theory and practice? The least we can say is that there is no necessary reason to assume that Leibniz, even if he accepts the theory of monads as an adequate philosophical theory, also held this theory as his final metaphysics. In his preface to Fremont's edition of Leibniz's correspondence with de Bossis, Michel Serres therefore hints at a second monadology, which differs from the first because it is no longer atomistic, but relational. Yet secondness is in no way at odds with firstness, but a sign of increasing reflexivity and positive contamination. This is because matter only comes to matter, that is, to be felt as a becoming, in a certain manner. When we become aware that there is more to it than we are already familiar with. As Whitehead says, between the immediately given and relevant future, becoming is the transformation of incoherence into coherence and proceeds through comparative relevance and of comparative vagueness. Since the body is real for de Bossis, it offers Leibniz a new mode of looking back at his own doctrine of substances. In making explicit what it implies from the other's point of view, Leibniz establishes a synthesis where previously there was none, and thereby does justice to reality more fully. Vivificat, how to connect Christ to the body in a living memory of the past. Material world differently. This is done not just by speaking of Christ, but by demonstratively keeping his mission alive. Between matter and manner, the communication of content and the expressive gesture, there must be a continuous circuit of reciprocal potentialization. The work to be done for Leibniz is precisely to contribute to the realization of phenomena through discourse. It is a question of making, see, and feel. As Soriao says, the word can gain in grandeur by becoming flesh, since such work requires flesh, but only as long as it is understood that transcendence is not first, but acquired, a sort of harmony, a sort of sufficient analogy, without a pre-existing model of perfection. Secondness is the playful practice of perfection. It is to render more perfect, more harmonious, ground diversity by increasing the ratio of secondary identity to diversity. Similarly, in variety, that is, diversity compensated by identity. Leibniz always compensates for difference, but never reduces it. We shouldn't think that the Leibnizian corpus is no longer itself an oeuvre still to be done. What do we make of Leibniz? Fremont proposes a pluralist reading of Leibniz and of the problem of embodiment in particular. Accordingly, the vinculum is not just a key element in any metaphysical account of how harmony is realized, but also exemplary for the Mannerist praxis of philosophy. The Leibnizian system is a theory of communication in matter flows, to which the union of natures in Christ is analogous. If God is the necessity of analysis, Christ is the possibility of synthesis. This, here, now, is the mode of X. Considered in the sense of a general Christology, Christ is less a model than the single and singularizing demand that peace is possible, always on its way to further concretization in the form of a materialization of harmony. That is, the instauration of real compossibility where there appeared to be only incompossibility. As the dynamic modernization of substantial forms as principles of effort and demand indicates, Leibniz is not a substantialist, but a Mannerist who sees an immediate relation between form and force. One should therefore not read modal metaphysics as a theoretical philosophy. Rather, to rationalize is to put in relation theoria cum praxi. Forces do not exist in the mode of unities for themselves, but only in interaction with other forces that resist them, and in conjunction with which they become oriented and compose bodies. At the basis of Mannerist spirituality lies energia, or evidentia, understood as a subspecies of the broader energia. The participatory experience generated by poets, writers, orators, and artists that awakens the passion of Christ. Through Des Bosses, Leibniz inherits the 16th century debate about the role of images in art in religious experience. We should read their entire correspondence as the piecemeal convergence of the demands of Catholic mystery, Aristotelianism, sense experience, and metaphysics in a system, not of deductions and judgments, but of beliefs and effects. Since the proof of reality lies in manner, not matter, the operative reinvention of substantial form as mode of actualization constitutes precisely what Agamben calls a threshold of indifference between ontology and ethics. We should take Leibniz, the hybristic inventor of artful principles that exclude nothing, as the diplomatic philosopher par excellence. Leibniz is a speculative pragmatist avant la lettre. That is, someone who cares about the production of reality more than the reality of production, who always argues from the outcome, who consistently activates what he cannot enact on his own, and for whom metaphysics itself is a form of politeness aimed at increasing the coherence of the world. It is this pragmatism that distinguishes classical modernism from Mannerism in philosophy. Whereas it is easy to discover in Descartes or Spinoza major key thinkers who share an optimistic conception of the power of truth and rationality that is generally claimed by principled contemporary enlighteners from all over the political and scientific spectrum, Leibniz's so-called optimism is in fact more nuanced, no doubt due to the killing in the name of truth that took place in his time. Perhaps it was the sophisticated pessimism typical of someone torn between the roles of Renaissance mage and Baroque court intellectual that led to the demand that philosophy should never be opposed to the past, but always prove to be its worthy inheritor. While this demand clearly runs the risk of a much too clever lack of resistance, it is also, in the words of Stengers, a specific constraint that forbids the philosopher from judging over what doesn't meet the model's standard, and that enables us to take responsibility for the different modes of existence and becoming we belong to. Doesn't what Soriot writes about the shipwrecked sailor who wonders, am I, describe the characteristic asceticism of Leibnizian thought? The task is to answer for the world instead of the world answering for him. Leibniz does not merely mirror himself in all his contemporaries, but puts himself before them in the mode of an echo. This anti-narcissistic co-becoming is the constitutive relationship of philosophy with non-philosophy. A minor key rationality has no pre-established model, but only another possible world that is appropriate to it. Leibniz's Irenicism harks back to humanist theologians such as Erasmus and Melanchthon, but the artificiality and esotericism of the monadology were equally inspired by the great discourses on social comportment of Castiglione and Gratian, or a 17th century figure like Torquato Assetto, author of a book on conformity and hypocrisy titled Della Dissimulazione Onesta, 1641. On the one hand, the brutal reality in Europe of class struggle, religious wars, and Ottoman invasions stood in grave contrast to the development of a trade bourgeoisie, a scientific revolution, new techniques of government, and an elitist culture of extraordinariness and excellence. On the other hand, the Mannerist world itself emerged out of a desire to civilize the harsh contradictions of the time. Just as the Council of Trent set the terms for the liturgical discipline of priestly etiquette and protocols that effectuate the real presence of Christ in the sacrament, there appeared a whole civil culture of social presence, of being moved by and moving with others. The court became an artificial world organized around the idea that the impersonality of form, convention, mask, manner, and quotation provides protection against the chaotic flux of the world and enables composition of different interests and potentials. Conflict itself acquired an aesthetic destiny. becoming a question of the art and technique. If, in warfare, the available options are to attack or defend, at the institutions of the court and in daily life, it is to associate or separate yourself. As in animal play, nobody and no position gets reduced to what they are by nature. Here, artificiality or willful inscrutability is not a flaw, but an expression of the ability to endure alterity. That is, a second nature, but not a naturalization. Just as contemporary communication technologies arose out of the First and Second World Wars, moreover, the 30 Years' War had impelled new ways of articulating the common. And he should probably add in the American Civil War as well, the telegraph, which came before the First and Second World Wars. With Latin on the retreat as the pan-European language, Leibniz, like Athanasius Kircher before him, hoped to repotentialize our capacity for thought by constructing a new universal language of permutations, variations, and combinations, rather than referring experience to a model serving as a normative benchmark. His many inventions of the characteristica universalis, combinatory algebra, the binary system, and even music are inclusive languages that come flush with a feeling for singularity. That is, they do not deny what other languages say, but enhance them with new implications, without supposing themselves already implied by these other languages. Instead of replacing vernacular languages with a pure, adamitic meta-language of unambiguous meaning, they remain imbricated in the vernacular's infinite and continuous variation, augmenting it by realizing the virtual structure of common sense in an exemplary manner. For the same reason, Leibniz was interested in the operative languages of Hermeticism and magic, just as the courtly rules of decorum have a projective and conjectural function. Signs and images work as transformative gestures, not consolidating ones. Like myths, they seek to ritualize into being what they are about. Aimed at practical rather than theoretical problems, their end is in their means. In turning the world into a belief experiment, they serve not to claim the truth and expose things to the natural light of human reason, the archetypal gesture of the Enlightenment, but to decenter them in the scintillating swerve of obscure intuitions that constitute their different modes of futurity. Between signifier and signified, after all, there are all sorts of corporeal exchanges and incorporeal transformations. Instead of a simple, even proto-mythological opposition between noise and information, or between sensibility and thinking, the Hermetic philosopher knows that there is a reversibility between the two. There is a layering of the clear and the obscure, and of the confused and the distinct. Too much of the same becomes noise, whereas what is really new information falls on deaf ears if context and criteria of pertinence are lacking. On the one hand, to articulate is to give a body to the noise that precedes and surrounds meaning. It is to produce mutually implicative and reciprocal bonds between disparate energies, in a language that communicates with what otherwise remains mute. On the other hand, noise is also the redundancy of good sense. Only by staying close to the multiplicitous conditions of emergence of sense can we extend the scope of relatively clear knowledge without a totalizing claim? For Leibniz, every text is only a pretext, and every communication an initiation. Those who know me only by my published works do not know me. By moving in and out of the shadow, we protect what we communicate against the risk of overgeneralization. For the same reason, the very improbability and self-referentiality of formal languages are warrants against the seemingly natural claims of established and therefore exclusive ways of thinking. They disarm the situated as saturated by what has already been said and endow it with the possibility of new translations and inner variations. For Leibniz, the ars combinatoria, combined arts, is not a necessary logic, but a procedural code of civility at the interface of mind and technology. Where the vernacular hinders the imagination, his project is the construction of new forms of communication, in the noise to which we are exposed, and that allows for a cunning re-virtualization as per vision of world as it is. How to convince the Holy See to withdraw its damnation of Copernican astronomy by proposing that there is no absolute space, such that it is equally possible that the Earth circles around the Sun and vice versa. If Bruno did not recant before the Inquisition, despite being given repeated chances to do so, the beauty of Leibniz's gentleness, the de-centered presence of the philosopher, is perhaps more true to the Hermetic tradition. Another combination is always possible. Whenever we find ourselves among double binds, our aim should not be to get to the truth as quickly as possible, but to invent a new language. Perhaps we could say a queer language, though not necessarily in the German sense of queer, that maximizes friction in such a way that the various parties at war slow down and effective aggregation in affective learning processes becomes necessary. As expressed by his elementary mannerism folding, Leibniz always speaks in the name of a well-tempered truth of the relative, or what Stengers calls a humor of truth, humor de la vérité, a variation on amour de la vérité, love of truth. There is certainly more humor in tact than in truth, whereas the ironist never puts himself at stake. The humorist sets aside any prior distinctions between himself and the other. The aim of inside jokes, for example, is not to affiliate oneself with a single organization, but to expose oneself to a common perception of the situation. As Bergson already put it, laughter appears to stand in need of an echo. In this sense of a constant mutual attuning, such that no voice drowns out the other and thereby impoverishes the whole, Leibniz is a radical opportunist, arguing from the outcome rather than from truth. He multiplies principles in such a way that self-definitions, normative ideals, the sense of manifest destiny, aka modernity, or other delusions of grandeur no longer impede the slow process of composition by which we acquire a sense of what might be commonly possible. Perhaps we should say that philosophy for Leibniz was essentially a form of what Stengers refers to as cosmopolitesse. From the earth to the brain, we inhabit a plastic continuum of interdependencies. On each of its levels, networks, or planes, consistency isn't just a matter of subjective attitude or objective structures. Rather, it is produced in and through gestures and acts, the performative coherence of which is aesthetic as much as it is technical. Contrary to a deduction of the world from first principles, but following the calculus of minima and maxima, this performance can only be successful as a disciplined attempt to minimize requirements and maximize obligations, or in Leibniz's more aesthetically inclined words, to perfect a system that is the simplest in hypotheses and the richest in appearances. Finally, what Leibniz teaches us is that perfection does not know an economy, but only an ecology. And that is the distance of the things to each other. For what is harmony if not correspondence in diversity with no transcending principle or ground? The minimization of requirements, that is, making do with a few letters or numbers, is achieved through a radical decentering of the theoretical point of view with respect to the diverging interests of the world. It is an operation associated with the empiricist constraint of always beginning from the middle rather than from our habitual selves. The maximization of obligations, never losing sight of the possibility of peace, is achieved through the all-inclusive ambition of rationalism. Everything given in our habitats must have a reason. The principle of sufficient reason says, even if this means turning reason into an artificial protocol. What is at stake is the rationalization of belief, that is, not its detraction, but its justification. The cosmos is not created ex nihilo, out of nothing, but comes about by being articulated as a body of virtual reciprocity. Ancient Greek, the polis was based on the civic mimicry of a cosmic order at the cost of an exclusion of nature which remained arcane and neutral. Then public life in the Anthropocene depends on new artifices through which we can increase our responsibility. Nature, or the earth itself, should be regarded as mannered, just as artfulness does not by itself make works vain. Our ecological crisis is not simply a consequence of the total artificial mediation of nature through technology. In order to adequately represent his constituency and lure the other into a less adverse version of himself, the diplomat cannot do without seemingly empty rituals and affected phrases. In reality, if something appears natural instead of mannered, the primacy of the possible is quickly forgotten. Maybe a diplomat is by definition without law and faith, or indeed without principles. Yet, in the end of all Leibniz's mannerist elusiveness and self-betrayal serve only one purpose: a systematic composition of inessential forces under the sign of eventual love.
It seems like really this part was finally getting into what Sajord called cosmopolitics in our group discussion, that less militant approach to the problem that modernism presented. And the cosmopolitical approach is basically to like incorporate the old into the new. But there was a section here, it was a very long section, and you commented a little bit on the very end part of it. On the one hand, the brutal reality in Europe of class struggle, religious wars, and Ottoman invasions stood in grave contrast to the development of a trade bourgeoisie, the scientific revolution, new techniques of government, and an elitist culture of extraordinariness and excellence. On the other hand, the Mannerist world itself emerged out of a desire to civilize the harsh contradictions of the time, and I felt that shed light on how we can look at Mannerism as a way to understand something that's not well recognized about mid 19th century America.
Yeah, you've got those two conceptions of time space. And if you think about it from an anthropological perspective, it's called ecology, but it used to be spelled Oecology. And it's the distance between structures in any given society. So, how far are you from a post office? How far are you from a telegraph office if you're living in America? And the telegraph came before the telephone. The telegraph made the telephone possible. And he uses the communications World War One and World War Two, but that's a really key one that he actually misses out. And the telegraph had a big impact in the American Civil War. And again, we've got the ideas of two different spaces being like, if you think about the world of where Melville was born, 1819, in that first third of the century, for the first 10 years of his life, the main mode of production was agriculture, where people mostly consumed what they made. But then you had from around 1837, the steam train starts to arrive, but the Americans are already digging canals so goods can be moved more easily. And that just happens so rapidly. And then you have this modernization. And you've got those two time spaces. If you think about how island time is different or countryside time is different to city time, you've got those two different times coexisting and uncomfortably meshed over each other. The really interesting one is Mannerism being a way of dealing with things philosophically. Like, everybody who's alive in America today, or say the white people, were not responsible for the slave trade, but they have to live together with people who were formerly enslaved now. And how can you get along with those two worldviews or those two different lived experiences? So, Mannerism could be a way of those people living together side by side. They weren't responsible for it directly, but they live in the ruins of the previous empire.
They still benefit from it in a lot of ways too.
That is fair as well.
And then taking a more cosmo-political approach would be reparations, because it's less militant. Germany gave out reparations for the genocide they committed. And America has given out reparations, but it was to the plantation owners for their, quote, loss of property. But getting back to some of these other similarities between what Sejord is talking about for Mannerism and tying it to Melville's Moby Dick, you were talking about the temporal similarities. It was leading up to the Civil War. There was a lot of contention there. And it was also alongside a newly booming maritime industry. The spermaceti of the whale was used for everything, for creating candles, for oil, for holy rituals, paper with the blubber. But on this notion of new techniques of government and an elitist culture of extraordinariness and excellence, there was elitist contention there that's escaping me right now. The notion, on the other hand, the Mannerist world itself emerged out of a desire to civilize the harsh conditions at the time. Melville's approach does seem to be gesturing towards a more civilizing approach in Ishmael, and we'll just use the more ordinary definition of civilized here, meaning kind or whatever. But
Person who lives in a city.
yeah, instead of bonded servitude or the horrors of modernity. But Melville seems to be gesturing towards a kinder approach to the new influx of diversity that was happening. A lot of the different ways that he was writing the book actually mirrors the new ways of writing that the immigrants were bringing over.
Which immigrants?
I don't know. That's a good question.
I'll just read you this really quick. Early 19th century. So it's history of the United States, 1789 to 1849. And then 1849 to 1865, there's a slight shift. The United States was pre-industrial throughout the first third of the 19th century. So that's roughly from 1800 to 1830. Most people lived on farms and produced much of what they consumed. A considerable percentage of the non-farm population was engaged in handling goods for export. The country was an exporter of agricultural products. The United States built the best ships in the world. It's quite an incredible statement, because you'd think that the Dutch and the British were still the world leaders in technology. The textile industry became established in New England, where there was abundant water power. Steam power began being used in factories, but water was the dominant source of industrial power until the Civil War. The building of roads and canals, the introduction of steamboats, and the first railroads were the beginning of a transportation revolution that would accelerate throughout the century. And I think he was living in New York,
I think when he was writing Moby Dick, he was in New England.
where the Industrial Revolution was speeding up. He was born in New York City and third child of a prosperous merchant who died in 1832, left the family in dire financial straits. He took to sea in 1839. So he's 20 years old, as a common sailor on a merchant ship, and then on the whaler Acushnet. But he jumped ship in the Marquesas Islands. His first two books were about that.
That first ship, the captain was just absolutely brutal and was even known widely for his brutality and how he treated the crew members. But this section here, the court became an artificial world organized around the idea that the impersonality of form, convention, mass, manner, and quotation provides protection against the chaotic flux of the world and enables composition of different interests and potentials during this instability in the Mannerist period. And it immediately reminded me of the court case that was happening during the writing of Moby Dick, where basically they figured out that whales were mammals, and it caused a huge social uproar because this basically contradicted what was written in the Bible. It's something like, first God made the fish, then he made the birds, then he made this, then he made man. So people initially thought that the whale was a fish and that men were mammals. And so then getting this idea threw a wrench in that whole thing. And they had legal deliberations on this, which led to a bunch of confused ideas about whales as they tried to use an approach that would maybe satisfy everyone. But something that was interesting in this court case was that they actually turned to the whalers more than the scientists at the time, because the intellectuals and the academics basically learnt about whales through dead whale carcasses and the skeletons of whales, and had never actually seen a whale in real life. And so if you looked at the academic drawings of whales at that time, they looked ridiculous. So basically the judges had no trust in the academics during this court case and had a lot more trust in the whalers. But basically it's similar to this idea that the court provided protection against the chaotic flux of the world.
This is also connected to what he was saying and the other thing about how in the art history he was trying to explain Mannerism as a lost sense of gesture.
I mean, this next part too, conflict itself acquired an aesthetic destiny, becoming a question of the art and technique. Just something about Melville capturing this entire conflict in a piece of literature. This one went hard though. Here, artificiality or willful inscrutability is not a flaw, but an expression of the ability to endure alterity. Seems almost like superficiality is used as a strategy or tactic here, or something being indeterminable is not a lack, but a strategy or method of endurance. I liked that idea because there is a lot of indiscernible elements to Moby Dick, especially when we're thinking about the tattoos or the hieroglyphic nature of the markings on the whale's forehead.
Here, artificiality or willful inscrutability is not a flaw, but an expression of the ability to endure otherness. That is second nature, but not a naturalization.
Yeah, the second part was interesting too, but I don't know what to think of it right now.
Well, you could think about it in terms of multicultural society and people having other systems and other beliefs, and you just accept them. It's not a naturalization because they're not your beliefs and you're not going to adopt them, but you just accept the otherness. He accepts Bequeg's culture and beliefs. He's not going to adopt them, but he's not looking down on him for them. It's just that those are his beliefs. That's cool.
It's even more radical than that, but in Redburn, Melville describes the spirit of America as the innumerable Amazonian rivers. But I said that Ishmael's treatment of Queequeg's religion is more radical because there's a specific passage where he basically defines true worship as following the golden rule, treating others as you'd like to be treated. And he thinks, if I am going to treat him how I'd want to be treated, and I want Queequeg to adopt my religion, then I'm going to not only respect his religion, but I'm going to have to practice it with him, because I want him to practice my religion, at least to try it out. And so he says literally, in order for me to truly worship God, I have to turn into an idolater. And I always really like that. It was like the irony or paradox of true worship, is that if you want somebody else to try out your method of worship, you have to try out theirs first. And in doing so, you become an idolater. You commit idolatry.
So the United States Military Telegraph Corps was formed in 1861 following the outbreak of the American Civil War. And if you search for it, they constructed about 15,500 miles of telegraph line. And there's articles there saying it was the telegraph that allowed Abraham Lincoln to win the war because of the communications. So there's a lot of people going that way. But once those lines were laid, later on, then people like Alexander Graham Bell and others would develop the telephone, which was used over the same lines. You know how there's that every medium is, if you imagine you had a road which was built for a horse and car, but then someone developed the motor car, the bicycle. You had to have the last thing before you could have the next thing. That's a bit of a Marxist thing. Like everything has to be like fully expanded and developed to its maximum potentiality before the next thing can develop. That's a bit of a Marxist thing, but also every new medium will use the last medium. First you had the radio, then you had television, and then on television you basically had like radio shows on television, and then now you have the internet. I don't know if you've ever heard that there's an American band called TV on the Radio. It's quite a clever joke, but it's like every new medium will be used for the thing of the last medium. If you imagine television turned into this, you had these long form TV shows, and then media sped up and everything comes down to now a really short TikTok video, really short and pithy. But now with the rise of the internet, you've got all of these people are basically making TV on the internet. So they're using the new medium for the last medium, which was TV. And now you've got, because obviously people want it, and there's such a diversity of views, you've got all these people making really long form content on YouTube channels, which is like a nostalgia for the long form television show, which was on the last medium.